The record that ended my career as an honest historian was filed under a classification code that does not officially exist. I have spent 11 years telling other scholars that. I say it in the same flat voice I used when I first noticed the code, the same voice I used when I pulled the sealed folder, when I read what was inside, and when I walked the long corridor to the chamber of the eldest council member and asked her quietly what the Kethera unsent were. She closed the door behind me. She sat. She looked at me for a long time with those old gray eyes that have watched 400 years of galactic records accumulate. The eyes of someone who has filed more sealed folders than I have written reports. And then she said, "Some truths are more dangerous loose than they are locked." Then she asked me to sit and she told me everything. That conversation was 9 years ago. I have not published what she told me. I have not told my colleagues at the archive. I have not spoken the name of the Kethera unsent in any formal setting, in any corridor, at any table, in any council, anteroom where voices carry and listening devices are calibrated to catch the particular frequency of a senior archivist who has found something they were not supposed to find. But I have written it down. What you are reading is what I wrote down. I am Sova Eth, third archivist of the Council of Amarat, or I was. My designation has been moved twice since that morning, demoted in the way that powerful institutions demote people they want to keep silent without making the silence obvious. A wider portfolio, a more impressive title, a posting so far from the central archive that the only things I catalog now are the agricultural survey logs of the outer colony rings. I do not complain. I knew what I was accepting when I walked into that chamber. I accepted it because the alternative was to know what I knew and carry it unrecorded. And that is not something I am capable of doing. A historian who buries the record is not a historian. They are just a keeper of selected truths, which is an older and more dishonest profession. Follows is the record, as I was able to reconstruct it from the sealed folder, from the fragments that existed in 17 other archival systems before those fragments were quietly removed in the months after my conversation with the eldest council member, and from what she told me that morning. I have corroborated every element I could. Where I could not corroborate, I have said so plainly. I am a historian, not a myth maker, even when the thing I am recording is itself a myth, close enough to one that the difference no longer matters. The classification code that flagged the sealed folder was a gray designation, not black. Black means extinction level, the records that the council buries because civilizations ended and the details could restart the process. Red means active threat, contested territory, species in open hostility. Gray. Gray in the Council's classification taxonomy means sensitive, unresolved, and officially unacknowledged. In 31 years of archival work, I had encountered gray designations 11 times. 9 were diplomatic embarrassments, the kind that happened when 2 allied species survey fleets overlapped in a mineral-rich corridor and both sidefold competing claim records that the Council chose not to adjudicate. One was an ecological report on a colony world whose atmosphere had been altered in ways the original survey had declared impossible, creating a discrepancy so large that acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging that the original surveyors had falsified their data. The Council chose not to acknowledge it. The 11th was the folder containing the name of the Kethera unsent. I found it because I was cross-referencing restricted movement records for the Vetheth-Amarat corridor, the long empty channel that separates charted, galactic space from the zone that every chart in every archive and every commercial navigation system marks simply as the null designation. The null designation is not a name. It is an administrative non-entry, a region that does not exist in the navigable record because the navigable chord was written to exclude it. Not because it lacks stars or mass or the physical properties of charted space, but because the Council, and every council preceding the current one, and every navigational authority working under the aegis of those councils, agreed collectively that the most honest thing the navigable record could say about the null designation was nothing. Every navigator knows what it means. Every fleet commander knows what it means. Every cartographer who has ever sat with the full chart spread across their display table and watched the clean-mapped frontier stop at the Veth Amarat corridor understands what the stopping means. The lesson is not taught because it does not need to be taught. You do not need to explain to a thinking creature that a border, drawn by the collective terror of every spacefaring civilization in recorded history, means something. The border speaks for itself. What I was looking for in those restricted movement records was something altogether mundane. A survey ship had been listed as traversing the Veth Amarat corridor in the 43rd administrative cycle, and its permit file was incomplete, missing the standard environmental return data, which my catalog required for completeness. I was pulling the corridor access logs to see whether the missing data had been filed separately under a companion record. Sometimes, when survey vessels returned with data requiring separate processing, companion record I found was not environmental return data. It was a personnel manifest for a vessel designated Cathara 7. The manifest listed 9 crew members under species designations I recognized, all of them with standard clearance codes. And then, the bottom of the manifest, a line that read, Cathara unsent, Grey class liaison, 3 assigned, 3 individuals, no names, no species designations, only the Grey class liaison designation, and below it a classification code I had never seen. Flagged it as an anomaly and moved on. A cataloger's instinct. Note the irregular item, continue, return when the primary task is complete. I returned to the permit file. I filed the environmental data gap as unresolved. I wrote up the standard discrepancy notice and transmitted it to the Corridor Authority for the 43rd cycle. 3 days later, the discrepancy notice back to me marked resolved, with a note indicating that the environmental data had been filed under the companion record, the companion record being the personnel manifest I had found, which now, when I opened it, showed no Grey class liaison line. The 3 individuals were gone. The classification code at the bottom of the manifest had been replaced by a standard survey completion notation. Someone had amended the manifest after I flagged it. That is not how archival amendments work. Amendments require a formal request, a reviewed rationale, and a countersignature from a senior archivist. The amendment I was looking at had none of those things. It had a single authorization code, and when I ran the authorization code through the registry returned a result I had also never seen. Code authority, Grey designation origin. Amendments under this code require no countersignature. Is no such provision in the Council's archival regulations. I checked the regulations for that cycle, and for the 6 cycles before it, and for the 12 cycles after it. The provision does not exist, which meant the amendment had been authorized by a body that operated outside the Council's archival regulatory framework, sat with that for a long time. A junior archivist might have let it rest. A junior archivist might have accepted the resolved notation and moved on, because the gap was filled and the catalog entry was complete, and there was no remaining administrative justification for further inquiry. I am not a junior archivist. I have been doing this work for 31 years. I know what an amendment that erases its own origin looks like. A legitimate amendment has a trail. This one had the trail removed. I filed no further notices. I told no colleagues. I opened the search functions of the restricted archive under my senior clearance level, and I searched for the phrase Cathara unnocent. 4 results. 2 had already been marked Grey designation restricted, which meant I could see the file headers but not the contents. 1 was a council session minute from the 67th cycle, a brief notation in the proceedings log indicating that the council had received a report from a Grey designation liaison body and had voted to accept the report's recommendations, with the vote result listed as unanimous and the report itself sealed. The 4th was the oldest. A personnel ledger from the 41st cycle, predating the corridor access records by 2 full administrative cycles, filed under the operations sub-registry of the Veth Amarat Corridor Authority. The ledger listed the Cathara unsent as an independent operational unit, attached to the Corridor Authority for administrative coordination purposes, with a charter description that read, and I have not forgotten a word of it, because I read it 9 times before the session timer ended my access, as follows. Charter. Terms the unsent operate under no council mandate and carry no council designation. Their function is the maintenance of corridor integrity in the Veth Amarat approach zone. They report to no standing body. They are funded through discretionary reserves, at the corridor authority's independent discretion. Their activities are not subject to council oversight, council review, or council records requirements. They are not acknowledged in the formal record. They exist because someone has to. Someone has to. I wrote those 3 words on a piece of physical paper, the kind that cannot be digitally searched or remotely accessed, and I kept it in my coat pocket for the next 4 days while I thought about what to do. On the first day, I went back to the Central Archive and spent 8 hours running searches. Not for the Kethera unsent directly, I was careful about that, but for related terms, Gray Designation Liaison, Corridor Authority Discretionary Reserves, Veth Amarat Approach Zone Operational Records, Transit Permits issued without standard crew registration. I found 17 fragments across 4 subsidiary archive branches. Most were administrative chaff, budget line items without contextual headers, maintenance logs for monitoring stations at the outer corridor edge that referenced inspection visits by unnamed liaison personnel. 2 were more specific. The first was a decommissioning report for a border monitoring station that had been taken offline in the 58th cycle. Report was signed by the Standard Corridor Authority engineering lead, but it included a handwritten addendum, physically handwritten, in a script I did not recognize as belonging to any species in the current council membership, that read, "Station maintained viable per liaison request through final cycle. Liaison personnel vacated prior to formal closure. Words of liaison occupancy to be filed separately." The separate filing reference cited a gray designation code identical to the one on the amended manifest. The second fragment was a casualty notification, the kind generated automatically when a registered crew member of a council-affiliated vessel is listed as deceased in transit. This one was dated the 52nd cycle. The deceased was listed only as liaison personnel, gray class, thorough designation, no name, no species, no surviving designates. In the field where the cause of death was normally entered, the notation read, Corridor Incident, Veth Amarat Approach Zone, details sealed, Gray Designation Authority. Someone had died working the corridor. Someone who had no name in the formal record, who had no species designation. Death was acknowledged only as a sealed notation in an automatically generated casualty file. A file that had escaped the broader sweep of Gray Designation amendments because it had been generated by a system that operated independently of the Personnel Manifest Registry and had been overlooked, probably, in the cleanup that followed whatever event in the 52nd cycle had made the amendment necessary. Printed that fragment on physical paper and put it with the others in my coat pocket. On the second day, I did not go to the archive. I went to the outer observation deck of the administrative tower, where my office was located, one that faced east toward the commercial transit lane. And I stood there for a long time, looking at the shipping traffic in the near lanes, the ordinary commerce of ordinary species, going about the ordinary business of a galaxy that functions because certain things are kept in place. The Veth Amarat corridor was not visible from that observation deck. It was 640 light-years away, in the eastern quadrant approach zone, past the outer colony rings, past the monitoring stations, past the last navigational beacon that any licensed transit vessel would follow. But I thought about it. I thought about it the way you think about something that has changed the shape of the world you live in. Quietly, without announcing itself, simply by existing. On the third day, I found one more thing. It was in the deep archive, the pre-council records. The ones from before the current administrative structure existed. From the period that historians call the consolidation era, when the current council was assembled from the remnants of 6 predecessor bodies that had governed different regions of charted space under different conventions. The deep archive is not well catalogued. It is well preserved. The conservation protocols are excellent, but the indexing is incomplete because the consolidation era records were transferred to the Central Archive over a period of 90 years by archivists with inconsistent standards. And the result is a deep archive that is comprehensive in terms of what it contains and unreliable in terms of what you can find in it without knowing precisely what you are looking for. I was not looking precisely. I was searching the deep archive for any predecessor body records that referenced the Veth Amarat corridor, using a wide net and a long patience, looking through the indexing gaps by hand in the way that senior archivists sometimes have to. The search took most of the day. What I found was a single administrative log from the Dova Marath Corridor Authority, one of the predecessor bodies that had governed the eastern quadrant before the consolidation, dated 112 years before the current council was assembled. The log entry was routine in format, a transit permit denial, the kind issued when a registered vessel applied to enter a restricted zone without the appropriate clearance. The vessel had been denied access to a corridor, identified in the log as the Marath Approach. The same physical corridor now designated Veth Amarat under a different administrative name. The denial notation was standard, but below the standard notation, in a separate field labeled Disposition Notes, someone had added, Vessel Commander briefed by Standing Liaison Unit per standard protocol. Commander accepted restriction. Vessel rerouted via Northern Transit Lane. Briefings materials to be filed under the Liaison Unit sealed charter for the Marath. The Marath Convention. I spent 2 hours looking for the Marath Convention in the deep archive. I found a reference to it in a consolidation-era administrative transfer document, which noted that certain predecessor body operating conventions had been grandfathered into the new council's administrative structure without formal re-ratification, and listed the Marath Convention among them, with a notation that said, details sealed, transferred to new council's grey-designation authority per founding charter. The Cathara unsent were older than the council that did not acknowledge them. They predated the administrative structure that maintained their grey designation. They had existed in some form, under some name, since before the consolidation. Since before the current Galactic Order was assembled from its predecessor pieces, inheriting not just the territory and the records, and the navigational conventions of those predecessor bodies, but also the arrangement. The arrangement that meant someone worked the border. The arrangement that meant the blank space on the chart stayed blank. I wrote that down on the 4th sheet of paper and put it with the others. On the 4th day I went to the chamber of Veth Ora So. Her name is Veth Ora So. She is 411 years old. Her species, the Mavserath, live longer than most council members, which is why the Mavserath have disproportionate representation among the eldest tier, and why they have disproportionate influence on decisions that the council would prefer not to revisit. She was 43 years old when the Cathara Unsent were first assembled, under their current name, in the aftermath of the Veth Amarat incident of the 41st cycle. She has been on the council for 368 years. She was there. Her chamber is at the end of the long north corridor of the council building, past the rooms that handle ordinary business, the trade arbitration offices, the species liaison suites, the cartographic standards division where the charts are maintained and updated, and from which the null designation has never been removed, because removing it would require a formal vote, and no council has ever formally voted on what the null designation means. They do not need to vote on it. Voting on it would make it a subject of deliberation. Making it a subject of deliberation would make it a question. It is not a question. It is the end of the chart, and the chart does not need a majority decision to end where it ends. The anteroom to Veth Ora So's chamber was empty when I arrived. Her administrative aide, a young Sethavarvel with the precise, careful movements of someone who has learned to be unobtrusive in the presence of a very old and very serious person, showed me in without delay, which surprised me. I had not made an appointment. Veth Ora So was at her desk, reading something on a physical document. She did not look up when I entered. She said, without looking up, Sova Eth, 3rd Archivist. You have found something. I had not announced myself. I did not ask how she knew. I stood in front of her desk and I said, I found a grey designation record I cannot account for. I found an amendment with no valid authorization trail. I found a casualty notification for a liaison personnel with no name and no species designation. I found a charter from the 41st cycle for a body called the Cathara Unsent. And I found a predecessor authority record from the consolidation era that suggests the arrangement they operate under is older than the council itself. She set down the document she had been reading. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "I expected someone would find this eventually. I hoped it would be someone senior enough to understand what to do with it." I asked her what I was supposed to do with it. She told me to sit down and stop talking, in a tone that made clear those were not requests. Then she said, "I will tell you what the Kethara unsent are. And when I am finished, you will understand why the record is sealed, and then you will decide what kind of historian you want to be." She was right that I would understand. She did not tell me that the files I had copied and printed would be within 72 hours, the only physical record of the Kethara unsent that remained accessible to anyone without a grey-designation origin clearance. But I understood that too, by the time she finished speaking. The Kethara unsent were assembled in the 41st administrative cycle, 37 years before the period my corridor access records covered, in the aftermath of what the Council's formal record describes only as the Veth Amarat incident, a phrase that appears exactly once in the public, in a single footnote of a navigational survey report, cited as the administrative rationale for reclassifying the corridor approach zone from monitored to restricted or access. The Veth Amarat incident is not explained in the formal record. The formal record does not say what happened. It says only that a survey expedition entered the approach zone, that the expedition was not recovered, and that the Council voted to restrict corridor access pending review, and that the review was ongoing. Review has been ongoing for 368 years. What actually happened, what Veth Oraso told me, in the flat, careful voice of someone recounting a thing they have not said aloud in a long time, was this. The survey expedition was not a survey expedition. It was a probe fleet, 17 vessels. The Corridor Authority at the time had been under significant pressure from 3 adjacent species coalitions, all of whom had competing commercial interests in the outer reaches of the approach zone, and all of whom believed with varying degrees of sincerity that the null designation was a navigational convention that did not correspond to any real restriction, that the blank space on the chart was a bureaucratic artifact, not a meaningful barrier, and that a well-equipped fleet moving with speed and discipline would find nothing on the other side justify the designation. The Council at the time was weaker than the current Council. Veth Oraso is not sentimental about this. The Council was pressured, and it yielded to the pressure in the way that weak institutions yield to pressure. Not by agreeing formally, but by failing to disagree formally, which amounts to the same thing. The Corridor Authority issued the permits. The fleet was assembled, 17 vessels with a combined crew of 4,312. They entered the approach zone in the 41st cycle, on the 44th day of the 3rd quarter. None of the 17 vessels returned, no distress signals, no emergency beacons, no wreckage recovered from the approach zone perimeter by the monitoring stations that the Corridor Authority maintained at the outer edge of charted space. Not one piece of recoverable material. Not one member of 4,312 crew. Nothing came back from the far side of the Veth Amarat corridor, and nothing has ever come back from the far side of the Veth Amarat corridor. And this was not the first time this had happened, and everyone in that council chamber knew it was not the first time, and they voted to restrict the corridor anyway, and the vote was unanimous. It is always unanimous. Veth Orasos said that last thing with a particular cadence that I have thought about many times since. Not grim, not proud, just certain. The way you say, a thing that has been true for so long, that certainty is the only register left for it. The Kethara unsent were assembled 37 days after the vote. Not by the Council. The Council does not assemble the Kethara unsent, and has never assembled the Kethara unsent. The Council does not know, formally, officially, in the language of the binding record, that the Kethara unsent exist. This is not ignorance. The Council knows. Every senior Council member of the past 368 years has known. The formal non-acknowledgement is not a lie. It is a structural arrangement, and there is a difference, though it is a difference that requires a certain kind of honesty to maintain. The arrangement is this. The Kethara unsent work the corridor. They have always worked the corridor. They will not appear on any permit record, any personnel manifest, Any navigational log, any communication transcript, archived in any system that the Council can be formally asked to produce. They do not carry Council identification. They do not respond to Council orders, because the Council gives them none. They operate with complete discretion, complete independence, and complete deniability. And in exchange for these things, they do the work that the Council cannot do, that no official body can do, without acknowledging that the work requires doing. What is the work? The work is the border. Not the charted border. The charts maintain themselves. Sense that any navigator looking at the frontier knows where the maps stop and understands what the stopping means. Charts do not need maintaining. The charts are simply honest. The work is the people who don't believe the charts. Every generation produces them. Civilizations, coalitions, individual commanders, commercial ventures, research bodies, who decide. Reasons that range from genuine scientific curiosity to pure territorial ambition. That the null designation is an artifact of collective superstition, and that a sufficiently careful, sufficiently fast, sufficiently well-armed expedition would demonstrate this. The belief tends to cluster in the same profile, species or individuals who have never been close to the border, who know the history only as history and not as recent memory, and who have a particular facility for finding reasons that this time, with this fleet, under these conditions, would be different. The Cathara unsent find them before they reach the approach zone. That is the simplest description of the work. They find the fleet before it crosses the line. They make contact with the fleet commanders. They show them things. Vethorasa would not tell me what things, and I did not press her, because I suspect the things are not recorded anywhere, and I am not certain I want to know what they are. They explain, in whatever language and through whatever medium is appropriate to the species and the situation, why the fleet is going to turn around. And the fleet turns around. Most of the time. I asked Vethora. So what happened the times the fleet did not turn around? She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, the fleet does not exist in any record, and neither do the Cathara unsent's actions regarding the fleet. And I am telling you this, not because the answer is too terrible to say, but because the answer is the same as it has always been, and you already know the answer. I did know the answer. I have always known the answer. It is the same answer that every navigator knows when they look at the corridor approach zone and see the frontier stop. It is the same answer that every fleet commander files into the back of their mind when they are briefed on the null designation, and the briefing uses the word historical, and nobody in the room believes that word entirely. The answer is that nothing comes back. Nothing has ever come back. What the Cathara unsent do, what they are, is the last checkpoint before that answer becomes the outcome. They are the last chance for a fleet to turn around and take its crew members home and file the null designation under the category of things that are real, that are not superstition, that do not require verification through contact. Most fleets, when they encounter the Cathara unsent, turn around. I asked Vethorasa about specific cases, whether there were cases she could tell me about. Not to put in the record, I said, to understand the shape of the work. What an intervention actually looked like. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, there was a case in the 73rd cycle, a coalition of commercial survey interests from the Vetharador species. You know the Vetharador. I knew the Vetharador, a highly organized civilization, mathematically rigorous, with an empirical tradition that they regarded as the most reliable epistemology in the known galaxy. The Vetharador had produced 3 generations of scholars who had studied the null designation and arrived, successive refinements of statistical modeling, at the conclusion that the probability of the null designation corresponding to a genuine was less than 8%. Their modeling was excellent. Their data was complete. Their methodology was sound. They assembled a scientific expedition, 11 vessels, the finest survey equipment their civilization had produced. They applied for corridor approach zone permits through the standard regulatory channels and were denied, and they appealed the denial through the standard appeal process, and the appeal was reviewed and denied again, and their lead scientist wrote a paper arguing that the denial itself was evidence of administrative capture by commercial interests that profited from the restriction of Eastern Approach Zone transit, and the paper was very widely read, and a second Vethara Door coalition offered to fund a second expedition if the first was denied again. The Cathara Unsent made contact with the lead scientist before the second application was filed. I asked what they showed her. Veth Oraso said, they showed her the return logs. The complete return logs, not the public record, which shows only that expeditions entered the approach zone and were not recovered, but the full record, which the Cathara Unsent maintain independently of any council system, which shows the entry timestamps and the last beacon pings and the exact moment in each case when the signals stopped. They showed her that the signal cessations across every recorded approach zone entry in the full history of the corridor occurred at the same distance from the outer boundary of the null designation, with a variance of less than 6%. The lead scientist did not ask what produced that consistency. She was a rigorous empiricist. She understood what consistent data meant. She withdrew the second application herself, and she published a revised paper, and the revised paper said that the statistical models used in her earlier work had been incomplete in a way she had not been able to identify until she reviewed additional data, and that her revised assessment was that the probability of the null designation corresponding to a genuine threat was significantly higher than her earlier estimate. She declined to specify a revised figure. She did not explain what data she had reviewed. Paper was less widely read than the first one. The Vethara Door filed no further approach zone applications. I asked about a second case. Thoraso said, the one I think about most often was in the 91st cycle. A species called the Orith Mela, a young species, spacefaring for only 4 generations, not yet a council member, with the expansionist energy that young spacefaring civilizations often carry. They had not lost anyone to the null designation. Their historical memory of the corridor was thin. They had heard the legend the way children hear legends, as a story about something that happened to someone else, long ago, that has no particular claim on the present. They sent a single vessel, not a fleet, not a military incursion, a single small scout craft, by 7. Young crew. Curious. Genuinely curious, Vethoriso said, not reckless in the way that the Vethara Door coalition had been reckless. Curious in the way that young species are curious about things the older species treat as settled. The Cathara Unsent intercepted them in the outer corridor before the approach zone. The intercepting vessel was also small. One of the Cathara Unsent came aboard alone. I asked what happened. She said, the Orith Mela scout craft turned around. All 7 crew returned home. They filed no report with any transit authority. The mission does not exist in the Orith Mela's official exploration records. The Orith Mela, in the Awesome, became one of the most vocal advocates within the outer coalition for maintaining and strengthening the existing corridor restrictions. She said, whatever the Cathara Unsent showed the crew of that scout craft, it was sufficient. And when one of the 7 crew members was interviewed, years later, by a journalist who had found an inconsistency in the Orith Mela exploration records for that period, the crew member said only, there are things worth knowing and things better left alone. And then they declined to say anything further. That is the shape of the work. The fleet turns around. The crew goes home. 7 people, 4,000, or 11 vessels of rigorous scientists. They all come home, and they are all different afterward. And the difference is that they understand now, in a way that the formal record cannot convey, and the legend can only approximate, what the null designation means and why the chart stops where it stops. I asked Vethora how many crew members she thought the Cathara Unsent had saved over 368 years. She said she did not know. She said, the records were not centralized in a form that would allow that calculation. And even if they were, the records were sealed, and even if she could access them, she would not perform that calculation, because performing it would require acknowledging that the interventions had occurred, and acknowledging that the interventions had occurred would undermine the structural arrangement that made the interventions possible. I understood. The arrangement works because it is deniable. The Council can receive reports from a grey-designation liaison body and vote unanimously to accept their recommendations without formally knowing what the recommendations mean or what body produced them. The corridor authority can fund an independent operational unit from its discretionary reserves without formally knowing what the unit does. The Cathara Unsent can operate in the approach zone without navigational permits, without formal sanction, without the protection of any council treaty or enforcement convention, because they do not formally exist. And because they do not formally exist, anything they do has not formally happened. And because none of it has formally happened, none of it can be questioned. I asked Vethora. So who they were, who the Catharansen actually were. What species, what background, what had they been before they became this? She said that varied, over 368 years. The first cohort had been assembled by a corridor authority director who has since been dead for 2 centuries. That director had drawn from the pool of people who already knew the border. Former survey crew who had been near enough the approach zone to understand what the null designation meant in practice. Former corridor monitoring staff, the odd independent operator who had worked the outer reaches long enough to have their own private understanding of where the line was and what it meant. None of them were combat personnel in the formal sense. None of them were intelligence officers in the formal sense. In the formal sense was doing a great deal of work in that description. And I said so. Vith Oraso allowed herself a thin approximation of a smile. She said, "They are understand the border completely, who are willing to work at the border indefinitely, who ask nothing from the council except to be left alone to do the work. That is a rarer combination than you might think. Most people who understand the border, they completely find it easier to stay away from it." I asked how many there were currently. She said, "Fewer than 40. The Cathara Unsent do not recruit widely. They lose people occasionally, not to the null designation but to time, to the ordinary attrition of difficult work in a difficult place. The work selects for a particular temperament, and the temperament is not common." I asked whether any of them had ever crossed the line themselves, whether any of them had gone into the null designation. There was a pause before she answered. The kind of pause that is not a hesitation but a consideration. She was deciding not whether to answer but how, she said. "There are things about the Cathara Unsent that I am telling you, because you are an honest person who found an honest record and you deserve an honest answer. And there are things about the Cathara Unsent that I am not going to tell you, because telling you would not change the historical record you are capable of writing, but it would change you, and the version of you that I am looking at now is more useful to the archive than the version of you I would be looking at." After I told you those things, I was quiet for a while. I looked around the chamber. It was a large room, simply furnished. The chamber of someone who had held power long enough to have no need to display it. A single wide window faced north toward the transit lanes. On the desk, a physical document, some ongoing work. On the walls, nothing but the administrative seals of the council and its predecessor bodies. Arranged chronologically, 7 of them in total, going back to the consolidation era. 7 administrative structures over 400 years of galactic history, each one inheriting the arrangement from the one before it. Each one maintaining the gray designation. Each one receiving the reports and voting unanimously to accept the recommendations. Each one knowing and not knowing at the same time. I asked her, "Does it work? The arrangement, the border, the whole structure of it. Does it actually hold?" She looked at me with those 400-year-old gray eyes and she said, "The null designation is still blank. The charts have not moved. The fleet count. The cumulative total of every expedition that has entered the approach zone in the history of galactic spaceflight is the same number it has been for the past 368 years, because the Cathara Unsent have ensured that no new expeditions have crossed the line since the 41st cycle," she said. "The arrangement works because it does not draw attention to itself. The border is maintained by silence and by the weight of the legend, and the legend is maintained by the fact that no one comes back to contradict it. The Cathara Unsent are part of that. They are the unrecorded part, the part that you were not supposed to know exists." She picked up the 4 sheets of paper I had brought into her chamber. She held them. She did not look at them. She said, "You found something real. That is rare. Most archivists spend their careers cataloging the record that was meant to be found, and they do excellent work, and they do not know what I'd have told you, and they are not worse historians for it. You are going to spend the rest of your career knowing what I have told you. I want to be honest with you about what that means. I asked her what it meant. She said, "It means the record you found today will be gone within 3 days. Every accessible fragment, personnel ledger, the session minute, the amended manifest, the code authority printout, the casualty notification, the deep archive predecessor log. All of it back behind seals that your clearance level will no longer be sufficient to access, cuz your clearance level will be adjusted as a standard consequence of the portfolio reassignment that is going to be offered to you tomorrow morning." She set the papers down on the table between us. She said, "The portfolio reassignment is not a punishment. I want you to understand that. It is an administrative necessity because you are a senior archivist who has demonstrated the ability to find things that are not meant to be found. And that is an ability that is considerably more useful to the Council's outlying operations than it is to the Central Archive. Now that the Central Archive has been checked." I looked at the papers on the table, she said. "You can take them back. I am not going to confiscate them. What you do with them is your decision. You are an honest historian, and I am telling you honestly, the record of the Cathara unsent is sealed because the Cathara unsent are more effective unsealed. The legend works because it is not explained. The null designation holds its weight because no one has returned. To give it a human face and a bureaucratic structure and a council charter. The border is not just a line on a map. It is a fact that the galaxy has accepted without fully understanding. The incomplete understanding is part of what makes it a fact," she said. "If you write what you know, you will be writing the truth. I will not deny that. But the truth of the Cathara unsent depends on no one writing it. The moment it is written in a record that can be circulated, it becomes a thing that can be argued about. A thing that skeptics can use to diminish the legend. A thing that the next coalition of commercial interests that wants to run a probe fleet through the approach zone can point to as evidence that the null designation is managed, that there is a body behind the curtain, that the warning has a mechanism, that the mechanism can be routed around," she said. "The warning is more powerful than the mechanism. The legend is more powerful than the record. The blank space on this chart is more frightening than any explanation of why it is blank could ever be." I looked at her. I thought about the 4,312 crew members of 17th vessels that had gone into the approach zone in the 41st cycle and never come back. I thought about the Vethara Door lead scientist sitting with the return logs, reading the signal cessations at their consistent distance from the outer boundary, understanding without being told what the consistency meant. I thought about the 7 Orith Mela crew coming home in silence, becoming advocates for the restriction they had set out to question, saying only that there are things worth knowing and things better left alone. I thought about the unnamed person in the casualty notification from the 52nd cycle. The Grey-class liaison with no name and no species, who had died in the corridor working a job that would never be in any record, and whose death was acknowledged only as a sealed notation in an automatically generated file. I thought about what Veth Orisos had chosen not to tell me. I picked up the papers. I took them home, thought about them for 4 more days. I accepted the portfolio reassignment when it came. I filed my transition documents. I packed my office. I shipped my personal archive materials to the Outer Colony assignment. I did not destroy the papers. The Outer Colony posting is quiet. The agricultural survey logs are exactly as uneventful as Veth Orisos' description implied. I have excellent cataloging facilities and very little of significance to catalog, which means I have time. More time than I have had since my early posting years, when the cataloging load at a junior station was light and the days had a spaciousness that the Central Archive long since consumed. I have used the time to write this. What you are reading is not a formal record. It will not be processed by any system that the grey-designation origin clearance can reach. It is not archived in any council system. It does not cite the fragments I found, because those fragments no longer exist in accessible form, and a citation to a sealed fragment is not a record. It is an argument. And arguments about sealed records are the thing that Veth Oraso told me the arrangement cannot survive. I have not cited, I have only described. I know what an honest historian owes the record. I know what the record owes the ones who kept it. The Cathara unsent are real. They have always been real. They work the border because the border requires working. And the border requires working because the blank space on the chart is not just an abstraction. It is a place where something exists that the galaxy, collectively, and across centuries of accumulated evidence, has determined it does not want to understand more than it already does. The Cathara unsent are not heroes in the way that history records heroes. There is no monument to them. There is no archive entry with their names. The combined total of every fleet they have turned from the corridor approach zone in 368 years does not know the Cathara unsent turned them. They know only that they were shown something, and that what they were shown was sufficient, and they came home, and sufficiency does not require a signature. The one in the casualty notification from the 50-second cycle, the one who died working the approach zone without a name in any record, is the fullest picture I have of what the work costs. A death that exists only as a sealed notation. A life that does not exist even as that. I do not know their name. I do not know their species. I do not know how old they were, or how long they had worked the corridor, or what they had shown the fleet commanders who turned around. I know only that someone filed the automatically generated casualty notice, and that someone in the grey-designation authority sealed it, and that in the sealing they did not erase it entirely, only moved it to a place where finding it required 31 years of archival experience, and a 4-day search and the particular kind of stubbornness that eventually costs you your posting at the Central Archive. I leave it here because the record exists or it does not. And if it does not, then what happened in the 41st cycle, and what has been happening in the Veth Amarat corridor for the 368 years since is the case of thing that history swallows whole, and the swallowing is never innocent, even when the silence is necessary. The Veth Amarat corridor is quiet tonight, or it is 640 light-years away, and I am sitting at a desk in an outer colony, agricultural station, and I have no way of knowing whether it is quiet or not, which amounts to the same thing in practical terms. The monitoring stations at the outer edge of the approach zone are operating on their regular cycles. The charter of the Cathara unsent, amended, resealed, transferred across 7 administrative structures and 400 years of galactic history, is filed wherever it is filed, under a grey-designation code that does not officially exist. Fewer than 40 people are out there, working the line, carrying what they carry, showing the ones who don't believe what they need to see. The chart does not move, and the legend does not need an explanation, and the border has its keepers. That is the record. That is all the record there is. I leave it here because a historian who buries the record is not a historian, and because the Cathara unsent, whoever they are now, in their current cohort, working the outer edge of the charted frontier in vessels that appear on no navigational log, deserve to exist in some chord. Even this one, even here. They are not acknowledged in the formal record. That is the only reason the formal record still stands. There is one more thing I want to record, because it is the thing that has stayed with me most clearly across the 9 years since that conversation, and because it is the thing that I keep returning to when I think about why I chose to write this account instead of simply destroying the papers and resuming a career at the Central Archive, as if I had never found the grey-designation folder in the restricted movement records for the 43rd cycle. Toward the end of my conversation with Veth Oraso, after she had told me about the Vethara door and the Orith Mela, after she had told me what she would and would not say about whether the Cathara unsent had ever crossed the line themselves, I asked her one more question. I asked her what had made the Corridor Authority Director of the 41st cycle decide to assemble the Cathara unsent. What had led someone in the aftermath of the Veth Amarat incident arrive at the conclusion that the answer to a border that the entire council could not maintain was a group of fewer than 40 people working, without acknowledgement in the outer approach zone. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, the director's name was Sethavar Korath. She was a Mav Sarath, a distant ancestor of mine, in the way that all Mav-Sarath of that generation are ancestors to those of us alive today. She had been Corridor Authority Director for 14 years before the incident. She had denied approach zone permits for 11 probe fleets in the 14 years, through the standard regulatory process, and 11 times the denied parties had appealed, and 11 times the appeal had been reviewed, and 11 times it had been denied again, and 11 times the denied party had gone to the council and argued that the Corridor Authority was operating in excess of its statutory mandate, and 11 times the council had voted to uphold the Corridor Authority's decision. Unanimously. It was always unanimous, she said. Sethavahar understood that the 12 petitions had not been the last 12. They had been 12 of what was going to be a continuous sequence, without end, for as long as the galaxy kept producing species and coalitions and individual commanders with the ambition to resolve what they regarded as an open question. The Council's ability to hold the line through the regulatory process depended on the Council being willing to hold the line, and the Council's willingness was not a constant. It was a function of the political pressure applied to it at any given time. And the political pressure was going to keep increasing. And there would eventually come a point at which the Council's willingness would fail, as it had failed in the 41st cycle, and when it failed, the result would be what it had always been. Sethavar Korath had decided that the border needed something that was not subject to political pressure, something that did not depend on a council vote, did not require a regulatory process, did not need to be persuasive to a majority of sitting members, who might, at any given moment, be under more pressure from commercial interests than from the weight of the legend. Something that simply worked. Something that found the fleets before they crossed and turned them without leaving a record that could be used to argue the process should not have happened. She had understood, Vethoriso said, that the most reliable form of maintenance was the kind that was never visible. A border that was maintained by regulation was a border that was only as reliable as the institution maintaining the regulation. A border that was maintained by a legend was a border that was only as reliable as the legend's power to frighten. But a border that was maintained by people who understood it completely, who worked it without sanction or acknowledgement, who need nothing from the council and asked nothing from the formal record. That border was maintained by something that could not be lobbied, not be pressured, could not be voted away. Sethavar Korath had been 41 years old when she assembled the first cohort. She had been dead for 211 years. The arrangement she created, this charter that she wrote, in that plain administrative language, they exist because someone has to, had survived 11 council restructurings, 7 changes in Corridor Authority leadership, 4 formal reviews of the Eastern Approach Zone designation, and the continuous quiet pressure of 368 years of species and coalitions and individual commanders who believed, each in their own time and with their own reasoning, that the blank space on the chart was a question awaiting an answer. It had survived all of it, not because the Council had protected it. The Council does not protect what it does not acknowledge. Because the legend had been sufficient to hold every skeptic. The legend is not sufficient for every skeptic. Some of them have excellent statistical models and rigorous methodologies, and they are right that the legend alone is not proof of anything. It had survived because Sethavar Korath had understood something that the legend and the regulation and the chart could never by themselves contain, that the border is not a fact about space. It is a fact about what the galaxy has chosen, across the accumulated weight of every civilization that has encountered it, to leave alone. And the choice, the ongoing active, continuously renewed choice, requires maintenance that is itself a choice, made by people who understand the cost of choosing wrong, and who have chosen, therefore, not to choose wrong. The Cathara Unsent are the maintenance of the choice. They are not heroes. They are not protectors. They are not an enforcement body, or a security organization, or a branch of any military tradition that the Council has ever convened. They are the people who work the edge of the thing the galaxy has decided not to disturb, and who ensure, by working it, that the decision holds. Veth Oriso told me that last part. And then she stopped talking and she looked at the papers on the table for a long time, without picking them up. Then she said, Sethavar Korath wrote in her personal journal, not the official record, private journal that has been in my family's archive for 2 centuries, unsealed and unread by anyone outside the family, of no interest to any archivist because it contains nothing concerning the formal record, she wrote, in the period after she assembled the first cohort and watched them depart for the corridor. I do not know if they will succeed. I do not know if the arrangement will hold for a generation or for 10 generations, or for longer than I can imagine. I know only that the border must be maintained, that the council cannot maintain it alone, and that the people I have assembled are the ones willing to maintain it without needing to be thanked for it, or known for it, or written into the cord that future historians will read. I am grateful to them in a way I cannot express, because expressing it would require acknowledging what they're going to do, and acknowledging it would require the kind of record that would undermine the doing of it. So I am grateful in silence, as they will serve in silence, and perhaps that is the right register for this kind of work. Vetharaso said, I read that entry for the first time when I was a young council member, in the first years of my tenure, when I received the briefing that every senior council member receives, the briefing that tells you what the gray designation reports mean, and who uses them and why you do not ask further questions. I have read it many times since. I still think it is the most honest sentence anyone has ever written about the Cathara unsent. I am grateful to them in a way I cannot express, because expressing it would require acknowledging what they are. She said it without sentimentality, just as a thing she believed. I left the chamber with the papers in my pocket. I have thought about Sethavar Korath's journal entry many times since, about the phrase grateful in silence, as they will serve in silence, and the phrase the right register for this kind of work. There is something in it that is closer to the truth of the Cathara unsent than anything in the formal record, which is perhaps why Sethavar Korath wrote it in the private journal instead. The formal record is not built for this kind of truth. It is built for things that can be acknowledged, and some truths live entirely outside that category. I have tried to preserve this truth without destroying the arrangement it describes. I do not know whether I have succeeded. I know only that I have been as honest as I am capable of being, and that the record I have written is the fullest account I am able to give, and that somewhere in the outer approach zone of the Veth Amarat corridor, tonight and every night, fewer than 40 people are doing work that will not appear in any record I write, or any record anyone else writes, and that the chart does not move, and the legend stands, and the border holds. That is what it means to be the Cathara unsent. No council sent them. The border has always had its keepers. That is the whole of it.